is up, weather enthusiasts? I'm your host, Pat's Path Predictor. Let's get right into the weather. All right, so here's the situation we have for you, ladies and gentlemen. We have a few things that we're going to be going over with you today. We're also going to be looking at a few new sources and a few new sites to kind of show you, as well as to determine what the MJO is doing, as well as the ITCZ, because I've been getting some comments on a few things like that. And we're going to be talking about what's been potentially going to be happening in the Gulf at this current point. So we're going to want to pay very close attention to all of that moving forward. But with that being said, let's go ahead and dive right into it right here. So here's what we have going on across much of the Atlantic at this current point. Here's their satellite imagery right here. We have a pretty nasty and pretty big, robust tropical wave coming off the coast of Africa right now. That's bringing a bit of a moisture surge to much of the main development region in the Atlantic. However, because there's Sahara dust to the north and to the west of it, I do not expect this system to develop really at all or anything like that. At this current point in time, but it is going to take a few days for it to travel before it ultimately starts to dissipate and fizzle out at this current point, and that could mean some more indicators moving forward at this current point in time. And we can go ahead and zoom in a little bit, and I can kind of explain to you why I think that. So here's what we have going on right here. This is our tropical wave right here. Currently, it's just south of the Cabo Verde Islands. I'm noticing these waves are moving further and further and further up to the north. I've noticed, and we'll get into why in just a second. But ultimately, you're starting to see more of these northward shifts in the tropical waves that we are seeing, because before we were seeing this like south of 10 degrees to the north in some instances, and or just barely around 10 degrees to the north in terms of latitude, and not really close to the Cabo Verde Islands as of yet. This is one of the first times that we've seen a tropical wave move closer towards the Cabo Verde Islands than not, and it's kind of indicative of a northward shift in the intertropical convergence zone and a northward shift in the Sahara cell monsoon. And we can go ahead and pull up this graphic that we can go ahead and show you this. So this is what we have for you right here. As you can notice right here, taking a look at the lines right here, this is the ITF, which is the Intertropical Front over Africa right here. Some of you are probably wondering, Patrick, why is this relevant? This isn't talking about tropics or anything like that. How this is important is this is kind of an indicator of where the tropical waves and how they've shifted further up to the north, because the monsoon season's starting to ramp up in parts of the Sahel region right now in Africa, and that's where those tropical waves that come through, and ultimately, as we get later into hurricane season, that's how we have that situation where tropical waves that come off of Africa start developing. This is the source of that right here. So that's why we're looking at this. We're kind of looking at the source and going through it today. So what we're looking at right here, from the previous 10-day intertropical front position, it was much further to the south. It was kind of in southern Mauritania, central Mali, parts of Chad, Niger, and Sudan. That has shifted. That shifted much further up to the north, actually. In fact, the climatological mean is this black line right here. The previous 10 days is the purple line. Where it's currently at is the red line. And in multiple areas, actually, particularly this area, it's actually further up to the north than the climatological average of the intertropical frontal region right here. And I know there have been people talking about the ITCZ shifting further to the south compared to what we were seeing in July. We see typically in July, at least in terms of what's going on in Africa right now, it looks like that front has shifted much further up to the north. In some instances, like I said previously, further north than the average at this current point. And that's reflecting on what's going on with satellite imagery. We're having some of these tropical waves move further and further and further up to the north. And this has been a development that has happened over the last few days. And that, as a forecaster, is pretty interesting for me, to say the very least, because what that tells me is, okay, we're starting to notice a shift up to the north, and now we're going to have to see how is the ITCZ going to react as a result. Taking a quick look at Yoshi's website right here, as you can see, the trough in the front is currently over here in parts of northern Mali and Mauritania. Heck, it's even, at least of current observation, it's even extended into southern Algeria. That's how far up to the north this line is, but there is a monsoon trough that's kind of moved, and the ITCZ still has remained a little bit stubborn and is still a bit further to the south, particularly as you look at this in parts of the main development region. Given these new developments that I'm noticing and this tropical wave shifting much up further up to the north than previously, it looks to me that the ITCZ might be starting to shift more and more up to the north at this current point to kind of make up for its southward bias earlier this season. And at least with the ITF over here in Africa, you are noticing that shift. The question is, how is this going to replicate into the ITCZ over here? And I would argue it's already started to, because you're noticing at least the trough is getting a little bit weaker. You're noticing it's kind of starting to lift a little bit in multiple areas as well, so you're going to want to pay attention to that. We can also look at kind of the convection in the models as well to kind of extrapolate its northward shift that is forecasted. So here is the European run that we have right here. Pay attention to the main development region and pay attention to the ITCZ initially. We're just going to be talking a little bit about that, and then we'll be getting into some more development juicy stuffs. But ultimately, all the convection is pretty far to the south right here. You have these tropical waves coming off the coast of Africa. But as you start to look and as you start to shift, you're noticing the convection that is firing off is shifting further and further and further up to the north. It's subtle, but you get to the point where it's kind of, right here, like it's probably easier if I just do it rapid fire like this. You're noticing how it's shifting further and further and further up to the north. It's most pronounced between 72 and 120 hours out. Before it was a few hundred miles away from the Cabo Verde Islands. Now I'd have to say about 100 instead. At this current point. So you're noticing that shift further and further up to the north, and not just in the eastern MDR, but also across much of the MDR as well. You're starting to notice the ITCZ lifting. Instead of heading towards South America, instead it's heading towards the Windward Islands over here. And that's something you're going to want to pay attention to. So it does look like we are noticing at least it's forecasted, a pretty dramatic shift in the intertropical convergence zone with how it's shifted. And part of the reason you don't see as much development is because of how far south, at least initially, the ITCZ is. But as you get into July, that's when you see the most dramatic shift climatologically up to the north. And then August and September is when the ITCZ kind of parks and it kind of stays far enough north to allow for tropical development and low pressure systems to detach, given the amount of Coriolis force that these systems have, which that's a whole nother topic right here. But you are noticing subtle yet concerning signs of tropical of the season kind of starting to get its act together, and the season starting to try to wake up a little bit more. There's still the main concern, which is the Sahara dust and, of course, wind shear. But we can go ahead and extrapolate those for you very quickly right here. Let's go ahead and shift over to first off, let's shift over to the trade winds, because that's pretty important. Then we'll shift over to the wind shear. So here's the trade winds that we have for you right here. Pretty consistent across the board. Noticing this, the trade winds in the main development region are actually shifting up to the north as well, similar to what the ITCZ is doing. The strongest contours that you're noticing right here have shifted further up to the north, typically where at least the hurricane season's MDR would ultimately be. So that's something you're going to want to keep a very close eye on as well moving forward. But by and large, that's kind of a shift. And why I bring up the trade winds is because, one, that's indicative of weaker wind shear in the region, similar with the Gulf, which we will get into in a few minutes. But also, it's indicative of warming. The MDR is going to be a very big winner in terms of how much the water temperatures in that region warm up. And in many aspects, it's already starting to do that. And if we go ahead and pull up the climate reanalyzer and shift over to the Atlantic main development region right here, taking a quick look at it, you're noticing the surge continuing as we're now close to 2020 levels. Like, we're about to crack 2020 levels of the main development region. If you remember, 2020 was a very active hurricane season as well. So that's something to keep in mind. Before, we were getting close to around the 2020, the 1991 to 2020 climatological mean. Now, we're pretty much surged past that. The anomaly has surged from pretty much about 0.5 degrees Celsius above average to about 10 times that, about 9 to 10 times that. So that's what you're looking at right there. And those weakened trade winds, with how consistent, and the fact that they're shifting further up to the north as well, is only going to exacerbate that issue. And it's going to allow for warmer waters and more ocean heat content to move in that region for tropical development. So that's kind of your gist with the trade winds right here. Shifting over to the wind shear very quickly at this current point. Here's the 200 to 850 millibar wind shear for you guys. Here's what we're looking at right here. This is pretty interesting. The wind shear across the MDR collapses. Right here. The Caribbean is the only area of wind shear that's kind of consistent, but even then that is fluctuating, and even then that is weakening and going up and down as well. The wind shear patterns are ahead of schedule, folks, and I've said this all week. This is a bit of a problem right here long term. And I've said this before, and based on the fact that the ITCZ is shifting more and more up to the north, I'm still kind of holding with late July, early August, when the tropics in that region wake up, compared to late August, like we typically see that. There's less fail modes with this. And yes, the ITCZ is further down to the south, which is kind of inhibited any more tropical development from happening, but it's shifting up to the north as well. You're starting to notice that jolt back up, as we showed you previously. But ultimately, the wind shear that you're seeing right here, it's consistently low across the board, across much of the main development region. And yes, there are some low pressure signals from the European right there. Those are mainly tropical waves. They'll probably not do too much because of the Sahara dust, but the Sahara dust even then is weakening as well. And we can go ahead and show you that as well. So taking a quick look at the moisture right here, the relative humidity, yeah, it's got Sahara dust in the northern part of the MDR and those areas as well. And ultimately, what you're noticing is more humidity further up to the north, as I'm noticing, and you're also noticing a lot of the Sahara dust getting pushed towards Iberia, France, similar to what we've been talking about previously. Yes, some Sahara dust is going to come down, and dry air is going to kind of still suppress it a little bit, but we're not looking at as much of a suppression compared to what we were seeing previously. So that's something to pay attention to. And we're also noticing the tropical waves in these model runs shifting further up to the north as a result too. So everything is starting to kind of click in place pretty dramatically at this current point. So now taking a quick look at the anomalies right here, the precipitable water. Here's what we got going on. It's a much more moist environment, like I've said. And it's not just in the MDR, it's across the entire Atlantic, too. Yes, there is some more dry air that's going to kind of go in, and you still have those fluctuations, but you're still looking at a significantly more moist air mass than we did last year. And even in the Western Atlantic, too, when you see fluctuations like that this early on in the season, when Sahara dust is supposed to be suppressing development over there, even then that's not a good sign. And I think that's also why the Climate Prediction Center, which I will get into right about now, tagged the Gulf region as an area of interest for development. Now, we have seen a few operational runs kind of indicating something like a contour, a closed contour, not exactly tagged as a low happening in the Gulf. We're going to want to pay attention to that, considering that is a little bit of an uptick from the operational runs from the last couple of days. But ultimately, that's what's starting to happen, and you're noticing, at least with these conditions in the Gulf as well, you're noticing that, at least for tropical development next week, they're not terrible, and they're actually getting better. As a matter of fact, looking at the dry air aspect of it, there's more moisture than what we were seeing previously. I want to actually pull this up. This is what we saw yesterday. Yeah, this is considerably drier at this point yesterday, and looking at the 12Z from yesterday, it starts moistening up a bit more, and then looking at what we see today, bam, much of the Gulf is in a much more moist environment compared to the model runs that we were seeing previously. Yes, there was a little bit of uncertainty going that far, but when you start seeing consistent shifts like that in the runs, you should be going, oh crap, there might be picking up on something, at least in terms of the moisture, because moisture to me was always the significant factor that kind of inhibited and kind of made me skeptical on why the CPC designated this as an area of potential development. Now, seeing the shifts in the models as more data continues to come in, it is kind of becoming less of a concern for me because of the more moist environment we're seeing in this region right there. And granted, there is still some dry air to be concerned about, but ultimately, you have more moisture for this kind of area of development to work with than what we were looking at previously. Now, picking up and taking a quick look at the wind shear in the region. Wind shear is pretty interesting. I would say the wind shear remains pretty low across the northern Gulf until from the 13th to the 14th, even the 15th. Yes, there is some fluctuations going there, and the 16th, yeah, that's when the wind shear does start to come in a little bit, but it starts to clear out a little bit more by the 20th and the 22nd as well. So you're noticing those fluctuations in wind shear across the Gulf. That's kind of going up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. That's typically what you would see for a pattern like this for around this time. It is a little bit earlier than scheduled. In the MDR, it's absolutely much more obvious, but in the Western Atlantic, it's a bit more subtle and kind of where we would normally look with the fluctuations. But ultimately, that's kind of your situation for tropical development, and let's not even discount the warm water temperatures. As you're seeing with the water temperatures, we're seeing a pretty big explosion everywhere across the Atlantic, not just in the Gulf, but also the Caribbean. You're starting to notice 30 Celsius starting to creep out of Cuba, 31 degrees Celsius, pretty much between the Isle of Youth and the Cuban mainland. You're also noticing 30-degree contours in the Bahamas as well. But ultimately, the main development region is starting to recover a bit more, and you're noticing more of these water temperatures starting to increase considerably moving forward. The Atlantic over here, the Atlantic basin has started to slow down a little bit, mainly because of those stronger trade winds over there. But ultimately, considering the amount of warming we saw, it was pretty astronomical and pretty concerning for me as a forecaster, to say the very least, at least with the water temperatures. Looking at the climate reanalyzer once again, taking a quick look at the North Atlantic at large, a pretty considerable bump going right there. You're pretty much in third place for the water temperatures at this current point. You're going to want to keep a close eye on this, but take a quick look at the Gulf, ladies and gentlemen. Gulf, once again, we've passed 2024 levels. Again, it doesn't really mean too much in isolation, but if you take a deeper look, it's pretty concerning to say the very least, and it's especially concerning looking at the ocean heat content maps moving forward. The OHC continues to bubble up across much of the Caribbean, across parts of the MDR. It's shifting further and further up to the north as well. And you're also noticing, at least across much of the Gulf, you're noticing, yes, there's less OHC than what we were seeing previously current, but that doesn't really matter because that's still 125 plus OHC. That's still conducive for rapid strengthening regardless. But you're noticing more and more of this OHC in the Western Gulf and in the Northeastern Gulf as well. Even in some shallow areas, you're noticing a lot of this stuff. Now, granted, by the time we get over there, it's less of a situation where we rely on the OHC and more just the sea surface temperatures, because just how piping hot they are at this current point. 31 degrees Celsius along the Louisiana coast is pretty scary to look at. And for those of you who do not know, at 31 degrees Celsius, that's 88 degrees Fahrenheit of water temperatures. That's upper 80s temperatures along the Gulf Coast right now. If I were you, I would not be swimming in that if I were vacationing in Louisiana and going to the beach and all that stuff. But just because of how piping hot they are and how uncomfortable they can be. But that also can fuel tropical cyclones as well. And that's the threats that we pay attention to as well. And kind of the reason I hone in so much on the OHC is because the water surface temperatures don't often matter. It's how deep down they go. Because if you have like 30 degrees Celsius of water at the surface, and then 20 meters down, it drops down to like 20. That's not going to really do very much for a rapidly intensifying system, because the water's going to upwell. There's going to be a lot of that happening, and it's going to cool it off and kind of cut off its source of theta E earlier. But when you see 30 degrees Celsius go down, and then maybe 20 meters down, you're like 29. And then maybe like by the time you get down to maybe 100 meters, you're down to like 25 degrees Celsius, which is about upper 70s Fahrenheit. That's when it becomes more of a concern, because there's more water to upwell and more potential for the system to continue to intensify. But those are all factors that we'll continue to keep an eye on, and we'll continue to keep you updated here on the Pat's Path Richter channel. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and close the video out right here. I really hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. The goal, as always, is to get more people engaged with weather. If you want to help out, hang out, or ask us some questions, be sure to join the Storms United Discord server. The link to that is in the end screen. And with that being said, have a wonderful day, guys. Stay safe. Be sure you go ahead and subscribe to Weather Kingdom, by the way. He does a great job with Storms United and does a great job with content and streams. And we had him on for an interview earlier. So I want to shout him out. Go sub to him.